This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
At Verbo, we understand that even the best of plans sometimes need a little support. So we plan for the plot twists. Every booking is automatically backed by our Verbo Care Guarantee, giving you confidence from the very start. Whenever you need help, it's ready. Before your stay, through the moments in between, and after your trip. Because a great trip starts with peace of mind. And maybe a good playlist. But we've got the peace of mind part covered.
Okay, real talk. Shopping doesn't always boost your confidence. Sometimes you just want to put something on and think, yes, this is me. That's why Stitch Fix works. You take a quick style quiz, size, budget, what you're into, and a real human stylist sends pieces picked just for you. Try everything on at home. Keep what you love, send back the rest. Shipping's free. No subscription required. Get $20 off at stitchfix.com/podcast.
Content warning. This episode includes discussion of rape, violence, and murder, including the rape and murder of children.
A serial killer went to Austin, Texas on December 6, 1991. He arrived at the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in that city where he attacked the 4 girls inside. 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, 13-year-old Amy Ayers, and the Harbison sisters, 17-year-old Jennifer and 15-year-old Sarah. He killed them all, but not before subjecting them to a night of terror. They were bound and gagged with their own clothing. They were sexually assaulted. They were shot. Then they were burned. He set the whole place on fire. The case went unsolved for years after DNA evidence cleared 4 young men accused of the crime initially. Then just this past year, Austin police announced that DNA and ballistics tied serial killer Robert Eugene Brashers to the case. The Austin Police Department's Detective Dan Jackson spoke at a press conference on this case. He indicated that he and Austin authorities had some help. One of the people he thanked was Steve Kramer.
Steve Kramer has dedicated his career to law enforcement. He started out as a deputy county attorney for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office in Phoenix, Arizona. He then went to serve the Federal Bureau of Investigation as in-house counsel for 20 years. In all his years in law enforcement, Steve has worked on a myriad of cases, from espionage to white-collar crimes to murders.
One of the most high-profile cases he worked on was the Golden State Killer case. He formed and led the team that identified that serial killer as Joseph James DeAngelo.
Like many members of that team, Steve has continued to advocate using DNA technology to solve crimes, including genetic genealogy.
He's since co-founded the company Indago, which works with different law enforcement agencies in order to identify violent crime suspects and victims. They specialize in trying to take on cases that were once deemed unsolvable.
Today, we will talk to him about his career, notable cases he worked, and his involvement in solving the yogurt shop murders.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is the yogurt shop murders and serial killer Robert Eugene Brashers. First person, Steve Kramer on the Federal Bureau of Investigation, DNA, and the Golden State Killer. First of all, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today on The Murder Sheet. We really appreciate it.
Great to be here. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, no. And so I guess to start off with, can you just tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your background and maybe specifically What drew you into law enforcement as a career?
So it's a long answer to an easy question, but I've been an attorney for the better part of the last 30 years. I actually never wanted to be an attorney. Uh, I was, when I was young, I actually wanted to be a doctor. And then in high school, I think that changed at some point. I was good at math. And then I ended up wanting to do like finance. So I was an accounting finance major in college, and I was ready to go be a CPA and then go off to business school after that. And then my father talked me into going to law school because he had been involved in commercial real estate and then the downturn in the late 1980s, and all he dealt with was lawyers. So he's like, you got to at least get a law degree. So I got a law degree, and I had no interest in being a lawyer. And during law school, I ended up getting an internship my second year with the San Diego District Attorney's Office. And I think I was the only person from my school that got it. It just seemed interesting. I'm like, well, I'm in law school. I might as well learn what court is like. I had no interest really in it. So I was like, okay, let's go see what court is like. And walked in the first week on the job. I was writing my own motion. I'd never written a motion before. And then I was told I was going to court and I would have to argue it before the judge, which I did. And it was really funny. I had a hearing and the judge totally quizzed me on like what a theft was. And it was a robbery case. And it was pretty funny. And I really enjoyed it, won the motion. And I'm like, this is really fun. And so I spent the summer doing that. And I decided, like, maybe I should try to do that for a few years. So I ended up being a deputy district attorney. I did that in Arizona, in Phoenix. I was called a deputy county attorney there. I loved it. It was great. I really enjoyed being in law enforcement, and I enjoyed prosecution. I was really fortunate that the Maricopa County Attorney's Office was a great office. There had been a hiring freeze for years. And so it was great because all the young, new attorneys, we got pushed up really fast. So I was, doing homicide cases, within 2 years. And that was great. It was super fun, going out to crime scenes at night, under the police tape, talking to detectives. I mean, for a 25-year-old kid, it was super, super exciting. And then having big cases. So I loved that. It was really interesting. And I liked also being just with my peers, with other 25-year-olds. We're all doing the same thing. It was a lot of fun. So that I kind of gave up for the moment of like doing anything in finance. And I'm like, I'm going to do this. This is great. And I ended up liking the investigative part of it, of cases, even better than doing trials. I enjoyed trials. In my very first year, I did over a dozen, felony jury trials, probably closer to 20. It was great. I mean, but I really enjoyed the investigative part, working with the cops, trying to find other crimes that the persons did, things like that. Long story condensed, I ended up applying to a position at the FBI in Los Angeles, where they wanted an attorney, but kind of like in-house counsel, not an agent. At that point in time, they were, trying to make all the agents be agents and instead of agent attorneys. And so they wanted to bring in somebody who had been an attorney, and I had practiced both. I had done some civil law too, but also a lot of criminal law. So they wanted somebody like that. So I got the job in Los Angeles in the Chief Division Counsel's office as an attorney there. And they also allowed us to be special assistant United States attorneys. So I did that as a federal prosecutor for 10 years of my 23 at the Department of Justice. And that was a fascinating job. And I can give you all kinds of examples about that. But that's how I kind of got to the FBI.
Wow. Tell me about some of those examples, some of those cases that you got to work.
The biggest difference between being in federal court or federal jurisdiction at DOJ versus being, say, a deputy DA is that you have just this massive power nationwide to get information. You have a federal grand jury subpoena, which you can it's such a powerful tool in law enforcement to get whatever you want from wherever. You need something in Florida, from some company there, a phone company, whatever it is, send a subpoena. It's great. I mean, and so that was very eye-opening to see that. And a couple of years after I joined the FBI, we had 9/11. And I remember that really, really well. Ironically, I I'd been in the FBI for about 3 years by then, and I was actually in business school at UCLA. I was working early in the morning and then going and getting my MBA at UCLA because it was literally right across the street from the FBI office. And so because I figured I was going to transition out of the FBI, even it was fun, but I wanted to do something else. And I remember, driving to work at 5 a.m. and listening on the radio about these planes, hitting the World Trade Center, and going to the office. And obviously it was chaos as far as what was going on. And it was a very, obviously it was a bonding moment within the country, a lot of patriotism, being attacked like that, but particularly in law enforcement. And yeah, it was amazing to sit there. I remember it really well. We were sitting in the Emergency Operations Center at the FBI on the 17th floor, watching all the planes, landing at LAX, hoping that none of them were going to turn towards like our building, one of the taller buildings, and near LAX like that. And it was a very moving time. And I remember I issued over 700 subpoenas in that case. I mean, we were trying to track down every lead, and this obviously went on for weeks and weeks and months on that. But it was a moment that, like, I think I'm going to stick around here in the FBI. This is really, really interesting stuff, and you really felt like you were doing, something good for society in that. And so that, kind of cemented my relationship that I was going to stay in law enforcement. So I ended up working there, being both in-house counsel for the FBI and also as a federal prosecutor. And I did national security investigations, prosecutions, as well as like white-collar fraud, investment fraud, things like that. So like one of the cases that we did in 9/11 kind of pushed us forward was we had a case. This is kind of the unique spot about being at the FBI, in-house at the FBI, as I had kind of a preview of all the cases that were going on. And I also obviously had a lot of FBI agent friends that would talk to me about cases, because any FBI agent, any federal agent will tell you it's difficult to get a case charged. Just because you're investigating a case, whether it's a fraud, it's a violent crime, it doesn't mean that the prosecutor's office is going to charge it. I mean, they're extremely busy, at the United States Attorney's Office. And, they, especially in Los Angeles, I mean, they're generally, because they're limited in manpower, they're only trying to take the biggest cases because where they'll have the most impact. And so, a lot of agents have cases and maybe they haven't developed the case enough, or we haven't dug into it enough, that it's not going to get the attention of a federal prosecutor. So I was there where I could look at it like, I think that's a really good case. So one of those cases was we ended up prosecuting a North Korean spy that was in Los Angeles, which is kind of cool. He was a guy that was being tasked by the North Koreans. He'd fly to China, and then from China, he'd fly to North Korea. And we had, obviously surveillance, the CIA, everything following this guy around. And so it was cool. Like we had like all the photos of him, on the street meeting with his, Chinese and North Korean handlers. We're surreptitiously going into his office, finding his code sheets, literally like all the stuff you see out of the movies, stuff like that, using FISA court search warrants, things like that. And that was really fun. And we ended up prosecuting him. We prosecuted him for being an agent of a foreign power, the criminal violation, not the regulatory violation. And I believe it was the first time that statute had actually been used, being an agent of a foreign power, 18 U.S.C. 1951, against somebody who had not committed espionage. In other words, he was being tasked by a foreign government to commit like espionage. He didn't get away with it. He couldn't find any classified information. He was trying to, but he was still acting at the direction of North Korea. We had all that information. So that was a great case. And we ended up convicting him, and they ended up cooperating. And it was fun because we had like the South Korean intelligence service come over and they wanted to debrief him. And so we had this, very cool international relationship with the North Korean spy to gain, intel on that. So yeah, that was a really good experience. And it was also kind of groundbreaking in the sense of using that statute that way. And you've seen like that statute, as well as a regulatory violation called FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act. It's been used a lot more since then. So yeah, that was like one of I thought one of the more interesting cases that we had done and I had been a part of. Probably the most interesting thing that I did at the FBI was, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but like one of the more interesting things is I was part of a super, super secret squad that they developed to hunt down, spies, things like that within the government. And
Oh my God.
yeah, it
Like a
was really fun. It was really interesting. And the idea was just pick out like a handful of prosecutors and agents, and I was one of the attorneys that got selected for it. We all had to be polygraphed for it. Couldn't tell, and we were just told that we were going to work in a separate squad. We had an offsite office in LA, all the money that we needed. We had, one executive that reported directly to the director of the FBI. And it was a great experience for about a year and a half. Any FBI agent will tell you just all the bureaucratic loopholes and approvals they have to get to do anything, literally like, to go record somebody. I mean, mountains of paperwork, approvals that you need just to turn up, literally to flip on a recorder.
Most CRMs are clunky and slow down your team. It's time to switch to a new one. That's where Pipedrive comes in. A simple CRM for growing sales teams. See all your deals and customer info in one pipeline. It's powerful enough to grow with your business, yet simple enough for your team to love using it. Switch to Pipedrive and join over 100,000 companies. Visit pipedrive.com/audio to get started with a 30-day free trial.
Here, we had none of that. You need to go someplace, you need to travel, no problem. You need to, rent a hotel room, expensive hotel to, meet with somebody, to have, some type of meeting, no problem. And so that was a really good experience where we ended up investigating and charging a former colleague of mine, a couple of former colleagues of mine, FBI agents. One of them his name was J.J. Smith. And it made national news. He was arrested along with his triple agent girlfriend from China. I believe her code name, this is all public information. You can Google it, Parlor Maid. But anyway, it was a very, very fun experience learning how this worked and how you could actually get stuff done when you didn't have to jump through, literally like 5 levels of bureaucracy to get stuff done, and just having a direct line, to the FBI director. And it was a very successful operation, and we rooted out, a lot of interesting things. I can't talk about that, but I can talk about like J.J. Smith and Parlor Maid. And we had one other FBI agent that was involved that ended up getting convicted of something. But it was a very good experience doing that. And that's one of the things I learned is like when you have just a dedicated group of very focused people and you don't have a lot of bureaucracy in the way, you can make a lot of things happen. And that was like kind of my takeaway from that.
That's amazing. Were you shocked that one of your colleagues was like spying, or that someone you knew?
Yeah, I mean, somebody I knew and somebody I'd worked with. Yeah, I mean, it was. Of course, it's very shocking when you hear stuff like that. And the part of the reason for that squad was to look at ourselves and that's why it was removed. It was separate. It wasn't in the LA field office. It was an offsite. It was, like I said, super secret squirrel type of stuff, separate chains of command. But that's the whole reason. So we knew we'd probably be finding, internal moles and things like that. So yeah, of course. And even outside of that case, over my career and separate from that whole squad, there were FBI agents that, we ended up prosecuting for other things too. I mean, look, there's going to be a bad apple in every group. So you just got to understand that. So, but the experience I took away from actually being able to work on a squad like that, where everybody was good and everybody was tasked, that was a great experience.
I guess one question I would have before I want to move on to sort of how you got involved with sort of DNA would just be like, how is working for the FBI in that capacity, how is it different than some of the sort of pop culture myths that a lot of people consume when they're reading fiction or watching shows or movies? What's the reality like? I mean, it sounds like some of that was like straight out of a movie, honestly. But what's the reality lived experience?
I think the the reality is, and I'm sure pretty much any FBI employee will tell you this, is that the FBI is very constrained, by its own policies and regulations and approvals. That it takes a lot of time to get things done. I had when I was a law clerk for the district attorney's office in San Diego, I literally had, more information a lot of times at my fingertips, in terms of being able to run public information and get information from DMV, things like that, than an FBI agent would have. And as an FBI lawyer, a lot of people would ask me, they'd be like, oh, it must be so interesting. You're probably dealing with like constitutional law issues all the time and Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment. I'm like, no, not at all. Not at all. I mean, like, yeah, it's there, but we're mostly dealing with like internal FBI policies, which are generally much, much, much more restrictive than the Constitution in terms of, what we can do. So getting through, those policies and those approvals is, I think what a lot of FBI employees, realize is, God, like, we just can't go out and be an undercover agent today and do a drug deal and catch a bad guy. We can't do those type of things. It's like there's all kinds of processes that go in and approvals that take, weeks, months to put together just to do an undercover operation, is a huge ordeal that might look really simple, but there's, mountains of paperwork, mountains of approval, dozens of meetings, a lot of times to get just a simple, undercover operation going. And so that was kind of the big takeaway that you don't see in the movies on how they do it. So, but, and the other thing too, I mean, there's, the movies always wants to make everything look a lot, very confrontational, particularly like, the FBI and the local police and things like that. And like, there's a lot, it's much more cordial in the FBI, even, among employees and supervisors and with local police officers. And like, we have what we call task force officers that are, a local, police officer or a local sheriff that's deputized and works as a federal agent, more or less as an equal as an FBI agent. And it's a great process. So, but yeah, I can never remember a scene where like the FBI rolled up to the locals at a scene and said, all right, we got it. We're taking over. Like I've never seen that in my life. Usually the FBI is on the sidelines and like, we're here to help. If you want our help, we'll do it, but for the most part, I think that's a little overblown.
Right. That's a trope for sure, though. That's so funny. And yeah, no, I mean, it sounds really interesting. It sounds a little Byzantine, but fascinating. And would for the lawyers who are sort of the in-house counsel for the FBI and working for the FBI, would you guys be like in every major field office, or is that, how are you guys dispersed?
Yeah, so there's 56 FBI field offices across the country, and every one of those field offices has an attorney called the Chief Division Counsel. The smaller offices generally just have one Chief Division Counsel. The bigger offices like Los Angeles and New York, they will have multiple. I think we had like 5 or 6, at any one time. New York probably had even a few more. And smaller offices, medium-sized offices might have, one Chief Division Counsel and maybe 1 or 2, assistant or associate division counsels. And like I jokingly but truthfully tell people, like, our job really is CYA for everybody. Like, agents come to us, management comes to us, hey, have you had legal look at it? And they want, your name and signature, or approval on a memo or whatever they're doing. Like, that way they can say legal looked at it. And that's, kind of what I always said our job is. You come to us and like, yeah, that looks good. Put my name down and I'm good with that. And it gives a sense of cover, I think. Because like I said, the FBI rules are really set up, I think more to catch agents doing something wrong. I mean, unfortunately, I think a lot of times it's used that way than to really protect any particular right. So there's just a lot of, the Domestic Investigation Operations Guide, I believe that's what it's called, the DIOG. Like, everybody's like paging through it. They come into the legal office and we're paging. What do we do here? What do we do here? Okay, you got to get this approval. You got to do this. You got to do that. It's pretty crazy. It's not like we can just go out and arrest somebody today. Like you need to go through all your approvals on that.
Yeah.
Operation plans, things like that. Yeah.
That makes sense. And so how did you're doing all this, espionage. I mean, well, you're investigating espionage. You're not doing espionage, but
Right.
how do you then start to kind of, I don't know, get involved with this kind of burgeoning DNA technology as far as a crime solving tool?
First of all, when I was in law school, um, I published a law review article, and essentially, if you're in law school and you're in law review, one of your assignments is you got to write an article. And so I wrote this article on DNA. And the reason I did that, I was working at the district attorney's office, and one of my supervisors there was a prosecutor by the name of Woody Clark. And Woody Clark was one of the pioneers in DNA from the early 1990s. He ended up being the DNA prosecutor on the O.J. Simpson case. So he represented the state of California, and he argued the DNA in that case to get it admitted to evidence in the O.J. Simpson case. So I worked prior to the O.J. Simpson case with him in 1993, and he's like, you got to write this article, because back then there was a big discussion in DNA. Everyone understood DNA is this powerful tool for law enforcement where you can identify people from crime scene evidence. But there was speculation that these incredible statistics, that someone could have the same, DNA, the odds were just incredible, 1 out of, 20 trillion. It was it could be biased based upon racial categories. So if you're African American or you're Asian or you're Caucasian, those odds would be a little bit different. And so you couldn't go into court and say, oh, it's going to be 1 out of 20 trillion or whatever the number was back then. So there was a lot of arguments on that. And so he asked me to write an article on that, which I did. And like I said, it got published. And then Woody Clark called me one day. He's like, hey, the FBI called and they want to talk to you. That was actually pretty cool. Getting a call from the FBI, and they had some questions and they wanted to talk to me about it. I'm so I thought that was pretty neat. And it probably helped me get a job after law school as a deputy DA. And so I did that. And I didn't really do a ton with DNA after that. I was familiar with it. Years later, so fast forward 20 years, and I was reading an article. This was, I think, 2013. And I read this article by Michelle McNamara, I think in Los Angeles Magazine, and it talked about this Golden State Killer. And I was like, this is fascinating. This guy committed all these crimes all over the state of California. We didn't know about this guy. We did not know we had a serial killer until almost 3 decades after the crimes were committed. And we had a serial murderer in Southern California in 3 different counties that we didn't even realize we thought these were 10 separate murders in Southern California, in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Orange County over a 7-year period. We didn't realize until 1998 when DNA connected him, and that DNA became the original Night Stalker in Southern California. And then we had this East Area rapist up in Sacramento, and that didn't get connected to the original Night Stalker until about 2001 when the DNA technology caught up, where the 2 labs could compare their DNA. So she had written this article in 2013 about she called him, she's like, first of all, because when we worked on the case, we just called this the East Area Rapist case or the original Night Stalker case. And so it had this great acronym called the EAR case or the ONS case. So we just called it the EAR ONS, original Night Stalker, ONS. So yeah, I'm working the EARS case, the EAR ONS case. And she's like, that's a terrible name. And so she coined it in that article. I think it should be called the Golden State Killer because he was all over the state of California. We never used that whatsoever, during the investigation of the case. It was always EAR or EAR ONS. And anyway, so I read about it, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and then I this is so interesting, and a bunch of these murders happened in my backyard, in Orange County where I work, and Orange County Sheriff is the investigating agency on a couple of those murders. And so I'm like, well, let me call Orange County Sheriff. I knew one of the task force officers was worked on my floor, literally 30 feet down the hall from me. And I'm like, hey, who has this case? Who has this EAR case? And he gave me the name of the deputy who I knew. I called him up and they're like, yeah, Steve, get on board. So he gave me access to their files. I called the FBI agent up in Sacramento. His name was Marcus Knutson. I'm like, hey, can I just work on the DNA aspect of it? Because I figured, I knew a little bit about DNA and how DNA worked. And I just figured I could maybe get the FBI lab to do something different, like maybe do a familial search. In other words, instead of looking at the actual DNA and see, his DNA was in CODIS. It didn't match anybody in CODIS. It matched, dozens of crime scenes where we'd submitted, all these rapes and murders, but we didn't know who the guy was. But you can do, for lack of a better way of explaining it, like a more relaxed search where it might identify like somebody might be in that database that is a relative of his. And if we find that relative, then we can come back and go do some basic genealogy and find him. That's a familiar search. It wouldn't work. The FBI lab wasn't really cooperative with me. Some lawyer out in LA thinking he's a detective, probably is what they thought. And they're like, yeah, we can't do that. We can't do a familiar search. It would crash the system. You'd give you too many false positives. And like, look, the detectives will take thousands of false positives. That's 1,000 leads we don't have. So it's easy to run those down. And my favorite was, if we do it for you, Steve, we'd have to do this for everybody. I'm like, this is a really bad case. Why don't we just see if it works? I mean, what's the problem doing it for everybody if it solves the case? I just don't understand that mentality. Like, great. Then we could solve the 1.4 million profiles of bad guys, murderers, rapists that are sitting in CODIS unidentified to this day. Like, why would we not want to do that? So at that point, after we had some young kids, and so I wasn't prosecuting, and I was looking for, at that point, I'd moved down to the Orange County office from the Los Angeles office, and I was looking for, something interesting to do where I could help out on a case. That's why I wanted to see if I could do something with the DNA on the Ear-Ons case. And over time, I got involved. I got invited to be part of the task force. We had basically one task force, but we had a group in Northern California and a group down in Southern California. So I was meeting at the Orange County District Attorney's office with their investigators and prosecutors, and we're trying to come up with a way to solve this case. And we're looking at the DNA and what could we do. At that time, we had Y DNA so we had CODIS, right? That's what they call an STR. It stands for short tandem repeat. That's DNA that's used in the National DNA Index system that everyone hears about. If you watch CSI, it's all it is. Today it's 20 different markers on your genome, and it's like the Powerball. Like Powerball is 5 or 6 numbers. You win the lottery, the odds are 1 out of 300 million to do that. Well, we have 20 numbers, and then to win that lottery, to be the bad guy, you have to have all 20 numbers, on the STR. So your STR at location 1, location 2, location 3, has to match the bad guy. And the odds of that could be, 1 out of 50 septillion, some crazy number. So we have that DNA. It doesn't match him. There's also Y DNA. Y DNA is it's a YSTR. It's on the Y chromosome, and it's only passed obviously from father to son. And so we can do that. That's useful. It's not to give you your actual guy. It's not that accurate. What it's mostly useful for is giving you a surname. For the last 600 years, particularly Western Caucasian Europe, fathers generally give their sons the same last name. And so you can follow the Y DNA. So I have the same Y STR as my father. His last name is Kramer. I have the same Y DNA as my grandfather. His name is Kramer. So you could follow. So if somebody has this particular Y STR DNA, there's a high likelihood their name is Kramer. And it's not super accurate, but it's a higher probability that you're going to have this name or maybe a similar name, things like that. So we had that on the Golden State Killer Ear-Ons, and we ran it, and we were trying different things. We didn't really have a lot of success. We didn't have any particular name. We didn't have any really good matches on it. But remember, I told you earlier about when I had worked on that little secret squirrel squad at the FBI, and one of the things that I'd learned, when you work cases now, particularly cold cases, and particularly if it's a high profile case where you got a lot of people, it's really important to stay focused on it. And I always what I've learned about cold cases too is if you treat a cold case like a cold case, oh, we'll get to that next month. We'll get that later in the year. Then the cold case isn't remain cold because you're just taking your time. But if you treat it more like an active case, well, why can't we do that today? Yeah, we need to talk to that person. Why don't we call them right now? And so there's like treating it like that. And then also what I found was really interesting, and I'm guilty of this as well. You know, cops, detectives, everybody loves to tell war stories, about cases and things like that. Hence, true crime podcasting, right? It's great. Like you get a bunch of detectives, particularly old detectives that, worked on this case, back in the 70s and 80s. You're going to hear great stories. And I mean, they're fascinating. Stuff that's not in the police reports, things like that. Probably not really relevant to solving the case today. And so you have a lot of just talk like that. And like, for me, what like I like to do is like, okay, I hate meetings. I'm like, I hate meetings. And I always like, what's the point of our meeting? What's our agenda? What do we want to accomplish? What decisions do we want to get in this meeting? Like, I want to know. Because otherwise I really don't want. Just send me an email and I'll be good. And so it was funny because I remember after a couple of meetings, like I had everybody's email and I'd send emails to everybody that went to the meeting. I'm like, okay, but before we left, I said, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do before we meet 3 months from now? What are you going to do? Okay, great. I took notes and then I'd write an email to everybody and be like, okay, this is all the tasking that everybody has to do. And it was funny, like the team got much smaller after that, like when you start, putting accountability on it. But there's people that were like on it, like got this done right away, a week later. And so we really developed like that as a team to focus on how to solve this case. Now, I wasn't going to go re-interview people. There's like, that case was 43 years old. And at the time, hundreds of detectives on that case, tens of thousands of pages of report. I'm an FBI attorney in Orange County. Like, I'm not even trained on, most of that stuff. I mean, I've been a prosecutor for a long time. I know how, to prosecute and investigate a case, but I'm not going to go reinvent the work that these career detectives did in this case. They all did amazing work, particularly, for the 1970s and 1980s, knowing what we know today. I mean, all of them did amazing work. I thought there was no point, certainly for me, to try to reinvent the work of, these amazing detectives that a lot of them had like spent their career on this case. This case was very compelling to people. People detectives wrote books on it, talked about it, wanted it to be solved. And I relied on all those people. I barely read a report at all in this case. Why? Because I had all these detectives. I could pick up, the phone and call them. They'd say, oh, this is exactly what happened. I talked to this victim. Like, so I just wanted to figure out a new way of thinking about it and why DNA wasn't working. And Paul Holes, who was one of the detectives in Northern California, he and I kind of saw eye to eye on this. And we're like, the only way we're solving this is if we get the DNA and we can get it into like a genealogy database. And so he and I, figured out like how to do, like, this is the way we're going to solve the case. We learned a little bit about genealogy, literally watching YouTube to see how it worked. And, but the best thing I think was and Paul will tell you this too, is like having somebody from the FBI. I always say the most powerful thing about the FBI is those 3 letters, FBI. When you call somebody and you say the FBI is on the phone, they need to talk to you, they generally put you through. So like when I started calling all the, genetic genealogy companies, Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA. And hi, I'm Steve Kramer. I'm an attorney with the FBI. I'd like to speak to you. They usually put, my call through. So I fought with Ancestry and 23andMe about trying to get in, and eventually got one of the companies, Family Tree DNA, who decided to cooperate with us and said, yeah, well, we want to solve this case. This is terrible. And so Paul and I were able to get DNA from one of the crime scenes, had an FBI agent FedEx the DNA out to Family Tree DNA in Texas, and they got a SNP profile, which is it's different than an STR. That's what you use for genealogy. And they got this SNP profile. Same thing you do when you do a cheek swab for Ancestry, you get a SNP file. You got a SNP file, put it into Family Tree DNA. We also put in GEDmatch, and we ended up, 63 days later, literally 63 days, our team of 6, solved the case. So that was the amazing part. 43 years of, work, from hundreds of detectives. And here's, 6 of us, 5 of us knew nothing about genetic genealogy. and we solved this major case. So that was kind of how it all came together.
How did that feel for you? It was like kind of jumping into this, running with it, and then, as you said, 63 days, after you submit this, it's solved.
Yeah, it was, it was really, it was a bit surreal. I think the really interesting thing to me is once I understood a little bit about how genetic genealogy worked, and there's genealogists like my friend C.C. Moore, who I know, like they've known this for a long time, like how it would work and how you could solve cases, but nobody did it. Like I always say, like I didn't come up with this great idea, and neither did Paul. We definitely did not originate the idea of trying to use genetic genealogy to solve a criminal case. We just, figured out how to do it, and we were fortunate, I think, that, me being in the FBI and having very little oversight I actually ran this past, DOJ and everybody. I knew legally we were fine to do it, but basically, having the FBI get involved really kind of pushed it over the edge because, local departments and stuff weren't sure, if they could do it. So we did it. It worked. But what I realized as we were coming to that point, maybe 6 months prior, when I understood how genetic genealogy worked, I'm like, oh, we're going to solve this case. No, I totally figured that out. It was just a matter of, finding, how to get a SNP and then how to get the DNA. And I told people in my office, and people thought I was totally nuts. I'm like, I'm going to solve 100%. Like, I got this case, solving it. They're like, what? I'm like, I'm going to solve it. And I remember very well, they're like, well, how confident are you? I'm like, I'm 100% confident I will solve it within 5 years. 100%. I am 80% confident I will solve it in 12 months. And I ended up solving it 6 months later. Our team solved it, all of us. So, but once you understand how it works, oh, you don't have to be in the database. You don't even have to have, your close family in the database because you have a third cousin that's in the database. And so once I understood that, I knew we'd solve it. When it actually did work and the match came back to Joe D'Angelo, yeah, we were ecstatic. And, I had a couple of my friends that in the Orange County FBI office, my friend Chris Gicking. Chris came into my office a week or two after the arrest. And he's like, Steve, I knew this would be a big case. We were all excited. Yeah, we solved the serial killer case. This is great. We're cool. But what we didn't realize was all the news wasn't that, this terrible serial killer, the Golden State Killer, was now in custody. The news was really how we did it, how we used genetic genealogy. That quickly overshadowed, the crimes of, the pathetic serial killer, Joe D'Angelo. He's like, it's amazing. This has really become a big deal because my phone is ringing off the hook from detectives all over the country. Hey, can you show us how you did that? We want to do that in our case. And so that, yeah, it was a very surreal moment. And literally none of us had any idea that, which seems kind of silly, that the way we did it would become the bigger story and would become this big technique. And then after that, my colleague, Steve Bush, who was on the SWAT team, he's like, okay, I'm done with the SWAT team. I want to do this. And, yeah, he and I, got together and we ended up solving another dozen cases over the next 12 months. And we basically created this FBI genetic genealogy team, from scratch, right there from my office in Orange County, California, which now is a national program, 250 FBI employees nationwide. And, they've solved everything from, the Brian Koberger, murders in Moscow, Idaho, to the Rachel Moran case in the East Coast, to, a variety of other, terrible cases. And so it's been, I think, the FBI has the largest genetic genealogy team anywhere in the world. So it was kind of cool to be a part of all that.
It's amazing. It's really, and as you said, it really opened the floodgates. I know there's controversy about who did it first and what happened, and we know Golden State wasn't the first per se, but it was...
Golden State Killer was the first time that genetic genealogy had been used in a criminal case to identify a subject. A couple weeks earlier, my friend Colleen Fitzpatrick, a very good genetic genealogist, they did something similar by identifying unidentified human remains. I believe it's called the Buckskin Girl. I remember reading it. I'm like, oh, it's cool. They did the same thing that, we're doing. But that was the first one. And then she had also done the Miller case, the canal murders in Phoenix, Arizona. And that was done through Y-DNA. Remember, I told you earlier that was done through like a surname search. She ran the Ys in that case, and the Y was one of the common names with that Y-DNA was the surname Miller. Sure enough, Miller was one of the suspects, one of the people they'd looked at in that case. It's a little bit different than like what we today say is, forensic genetic genealogy, where you can actually take the DNA, trace it through families, and, more or less identify, the person or the person's close family. So it's a little bit different, but not to take anything away from Colleen, who I like very much and I've worked with. The Golden State Killer, I believe, certainly was the first case where somebody was arrested for a criminal, like for a crime, through genetic genealogy. Now, I should say he was identified through genetic. He was actually arrested based upon the STR confirmation. In other words, the FBI CODIS profile matched him, the profile from the crime scene.
Absolutely. And thank you for that clarification, because they are different. But, interestingly enough, the YSTR profile, I understand it was quite important in another case we're going to talk about, which is the yogurt shop murders. But before we kind of delve into that too much, can you just tell me a bit about, sort of then, so you have this amazing success with your team with Golden State Killer, and then you're doing all these other cases. Talk me through then your career progression from there, and then where we are now with, I guess, Yogurt Shop.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So after a couple of years, a few years after the arrest of the Golden State Killer, as we developed the FBI genetic genealogy team, I'm basically on the road, flying around the country, giving presentations, how we did it, teaching law enforcement, teaching the FBI how to do it, building up the FBI genetic genealogy team, which, despite all the success that it's had, it's difficult to bring a new tool, a new technique into law enforcement. So that took quite a bit of time. And anybody that's done any type of genetic genealogy, whether you're just a hobbyist, doing your own family or anything like that, or you're trying to catch a criminal, it takes a lot of time. It's an immense amount of time. I think we estimated in 63 days to catch the Golden State Killer, we put in over 2,000 hours in aggregate. So in some of the studies have been done that it takes on average just over 12 months to solve a genetic genealogy case, in terms of that's how long law enforcement takes to do it. And so one of the things that we had looked at was like, why can't you get software? Why can't you get like AI to build these family trees? Because that's all genetic genealogy is like you take bad guy's DNA, you put it into a database, and you get a couple of, distant matches. Not a couple, you get thousands actually. But generally you try to find, a second cousin or a third cousin and build the family tree back where they all have a common ancestor. Then your bad guy is descended from that common ancestor. So then you have to build down all the relatives, which takes a long time and is super, super labor intensive, mind numbing. It's interesting. It's like doing a jigsaw puzzle, but, why can't software do that? And we really couldn't get the FBI to invest money in it. For my colleagues and I on the FBI genealogy team, we always joked we couldn't even get whiteboards for our offices to write stuff out. Literally, it was very difficult to get money to do anything. So yeah, in 2021, my colleague Steve Bush and I left the FBI, and we're like, we can do this better, I think, on the outside and innovate more. And so we started a company called Indago Solutions that takes DNA, that does, takes the SNP. We work with the genealogy companies, and we're automating this process to make it faster through software to do genealogy. Because the only way you're going to get this to really take off, genetic genealogy, is to make it easy for cops. I don't know what the real number is. Maybe there's 1,000 cases that have been solved in the last, 7 years. But I mean, that's great. 1,000 really bad guys, the ones that are still alive or, off the street. But every year, about 80,000 profiles go into CODIS related to a terrible crime, and that person comes back unidentified. So think about that. 80,000 DNA cases a year, unidentified. So our 1,000 in the last 7 years, I mean, we're not even scratching the surface of it. So to really, try to make a dent in that and actually catch these criminals before they commit more crimes that's why we're doing the software. So that's kind of where we are. And we work with law enforcement all over the country, all over the world, actually. And one of the agencies that we work with was Austin Police Department and the Texas Attorney General's office. So you want to know about the yogurt shop now?
Yeah, so yogurt shop. So you're working with all these different ones, and I guess how do you initially get contacted by those agencies to work on that?
So I believe it was 2021, Steve Bush and I, from our company, we were invited to speak at a cold case conference in Austin, Texas, that was put on by Mindy Mofford from the Texas AG's office. And so we presented at that conference in 2021, I believe it was 21 or 22. And that's how I met Mindy. And we talked about, forensic genetic genealogy and how it can be used on cold cases. And it went over really well. And we ended up developing a good friendship with Mindy in the Austin Police Department at that point in time. And it was shortly thereafter I was contacted, I believe either by Mindy or Daniel Jackson from Austin Police Department about this case called the Yogurt Shop. And so we ended up flying out to Texas, to Austin. I believe Colleen Fitzpatrick was there, Bruce Bedoli, who's another DNA pioneer. Basically, Dan and Mindy were trying to get all the experts from across the country together in one room. And so we were all physically in one room, and she had spreadsheets already done in Excel of all the evidence in the case where there might be DNA, because we figured that really that's the only evidence we had in the case, truly, was the DNA. And we did have some of the shell casings, and maybe there was a way we could get DNA. So it was a great way to start like this cold case. And if you recall earlier, I said, if you treat a cold case investigation like a cold case, it'll never get solved. And I totally credit Dan Jackson and Mindy Mofford that the yogurt shop I think Dan and Mindy both got assigned to that in 2022. That case was never treated like a cold case, like at all. And I love that. We all sat down when we had meetings. These meetings had agendas, and we had decisions to make at those meetings, and it was great. And so we sat down and started going through the evidence, all of us, about like what DNA we could use, what labs we send them to, what we want to do on it. And that's how, my company and others, how we all kind of got involved in Yogurt Shop. And we sat down and like came up with different strategies to try. And we tried multiple strategies to get DNA, came up with, with different theories, how we could do it. And, for the next, 2.5 years or so, we were slowly making our way towards, a solution in this case. So I think all of us knew it was going to be solved, one way or the other through DNA. DNA technology, like even since 2021, has improved so much. Where we're getting DNA, usable DNA for genealogy purposes versus even 5 years ago is just, it's incredible what we can do today with it.
It's amazing. So when you talk about like going through with ideas with all these different experts and people with experience in this field, is it essentially sort of like, oh, you guys should test this piece of evidence again and see if you can get DNA now that our extraction techniques are better? Is it sort of like that?
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely one example of it, as well as like just, and I think not just in the yogurt shop, but a lot of cases, whether it's an active case or a cold case, it's like, where else can you get DNA from? Like, what other items might there, be DNA on? Like there was a key, to the yogurt shop that was in the door, that locked the door. Did the bad guy lock the door? Like, can we get DNA from that key? Like things like that, like, touch DNA that you wouldn't have thought about, decades ago. So yeah, you go through, like, you're actually going through the different pieces of evidence and figuring out, like, have we tried to get DNA from that? So yeah, a lot of it was, honestly just, brainstorming, different places we could get DNA from, or where we did have DNA. Is like, a lot of it is, I'll just say this about the yogurt shop, and I think it's worth saying. I mean, that's just an incredible case. Like, and I don't know, I don't read a lot of public information on it, but I do know, like, from the police reports, the crime scene photos, what happened. It's probably one of the, if not, it's probably the worst case I've ever seen, like, in my career. It's a very compelling case, compelling too, because particularly in 2022, I had 3 daughters, all teenagers. And so I know what a 14-year-old girl and her, 15, 16-year-old sisters are like. And like, I totally get that dynamic of these 4 young girls, eating ready for a slumber party together that night. It's going to be a great time. They're happy. They're closing the yogurt shop. And then just to have this just absolutely horrendous, you know, turn of events. And you can't even imagine that. Like, I mean, what these poor kids went through. And I just have to say, it's such a compelling case as an investigator to look at, to think that somebody has gotten away with this, and the families don't know who did this, and that I can't, I literally cannot even imagine that. But I will tell you that all of us that, like, at that meeting, like, we're going to fall. There was just no doubt that we were going to solve it. And, I love the fact that everybody's like, never gave up. We tried to test something, no DNA, or the DNA was terrible. Like, we just kept going forward. There was just something, underlying that we're going to solve it. And, Angie Ayers and Sean Ayers, I met them, like a year later. And I remember telling both of them, like, we'll solve this case. Like, we're going to solve it. And I think they knew it too. Like, we're going to solve it. We're going to find out what happened to Sean's young sister. So that, I just have to say that, because was just such a driving force on this case. It was just such a terrible crime. And I mean, you think about it, like, here's a guy that, like, back in 1991 did this, lit the place on fire, with the victim's remains in it. The fire department came in, hosed everything. And literally, like, the firemen didn't even know until they stepped on one of the bodies. Like, the fact that they got any DNA from this case is incredible. And they did some amazing things back then too. I mean, I have to credit, the original investigators. They actually did, like, sexual assault examinations at the crime scene and then back at the police lab. I mean, that's how careful they were. So any of these cases, I always say it's always a team effort. Like, the people that, preserved the evidence in the very beginning, the people that did the fingernail scrapings and things. I mean, it's such a team effort. And, but in any case, getting back to, where we were, I'm frankly, I felt like I'm mostly just a cheerleader, to Dan and to Mindy, who are both, I thought, the real heroes that, really carried this over the line. And, I was happy to participate. I was honored to be, part of that team and, come up with ideas and things like that. I will tell you, if you talk to anybody, I'm very good about harassing people. Like, that is, like, probably my true talent. I'm extremely impatient. I am. And, like, I want to solve all these cases right away. In fact, my partner's the same way. And we were actually told by the FBI, by some high-ranking person at the FBI, this is a true story, like, you guys just want to solve all the cases right now, don't you? And we said, well, of course we do. And they're like, no, slow down, pump the brakes. You should take 8 or 9 years to get. I'm like, I'm like, 8 or 9 years? No. Like, we're going to solve these cases today. So I was very impatient. It was funny. We had Dan and Mindy and the rest of them. We had a couple strategies we were pursuing with the DNA on this case. And, that looked pretty interesting. I was harassing Dan the last couple of months, like, this summer, about we were going to get some other DNA tested. And it was funny. I was telling Dan, like, and we were getting ready to go, test this other DNA. And I'm texting Dan, like, I don't know, every other week, what's going on? Why aren't we doing this? Let's get on it. And, like, get off your butt and let's go. Like, I wasn't saying it, but I was, like, basically harassing Daniel. And finally he texted me, and his text was like, hey, I think I solved the case. I've been really busy. I'm like, you are such an ass. Like, who sends a text like that? Can you imagine this? We're working this case, for 2.5 years, and he's like, I think I solved this. I think like, what? And like, I'm like, and that's all he did. He didn't call me, anything like that. So, I obviously instantly called him, and he was laughing on the end. And I'm like, you're such an ass. You're such an ass. Like, I can't believe you. Like, what have you done? What is going on? And then he explained to me that, they'd gotten a hit in Nibbins on a case. That's the ballistics. Like, there were two, in the yogurt shop, there were two different weapons used, a 380 caliber and a 22. The 380 was only used once to kill Amy Ayers. And that casing came back to another case, and I believe it was Kentucky. But what was really interesting, there was a case in Greenville, South Carolina, and this is where the Y DNA came in. So one of the things, and we did the same thing, like on the Golden State Killer case, like using this Y DNA. So you have, I think in this case, you generally have like 17 to 27 Y markers, like Y locations on the Y chromosome. And several states, I think there's maybe a dozen states now, do this familial DNA testing, which I talked about earlier. But when you do familial DNA testing, they generally run the Y DNA if it's a male, and some of the states have their own individual databases. It's separate than CODIS. So it's not like you can just go and run it and it runs it nationally. You literally have to call up each state. Do you have a searchable Y database? Yeah, we do. Can you run? Here's my profile, 27 numbers. Can you run it to see if the numbers match? And so Dan and Mindy have been doing that with different states. And when they ran South Carolina, it got a hit to a case there. Now, that doesn't mean why, just because like I told you earlier, like my grandfather and I could have the same Y. My brother and I have the same Y. So it was very compelling. But then I think the detective in Greenville, asked Dan about when he said you had a match in one of their cases. He's like, any chance your guy tied the victims up with their own clothing? And which is obviously what happened in the yogurt shop. And that's when Dan was like, wow, this really could be our guy. And then, obviously there's other evidence that went into it, but the eventual suspect, Brashers, ironically, was identified in 2018, shortly after the Golden State Killer, I believe, through genetic genealogy by C.C. Moore, who had done genetic genealogy on that case. And I talked to her about it, and she told me it wasn't actually tough genealogy on that case, and she was able to identify Brashers as the guy on that case. But now remember, you have to have a CODIS profile to match to Brashers. So Brashers, they exhumed his body, and they got his CODIS STR profile, and they compared it to the homicide in that case, and it was a perfect match. Brasher's DNA was in CODIS, but we never had a CODIS STR in the yogurt shop. And same with the Kentucky case, they didn't have one. So even though Brasher's DNA, was in, at least as of 2018, in CODIS, it didn't match any crimes because, like yogurt shop, we just didn't have, that STR. But now we had the Y. And so then the key is obviously, and this is where, some of the other work went on to it, was, can we get an STR from yogurt shop? And this is, this is what happened this summer. And we took DNA from the fingernail scrapings. And this is what I thought was really, 100% credit to Mindy and Dan. We'd already tested those for DNA 6 years earlier. And that DNA, that fingernail scraping didn't produce any usable DNA. So this time, Dan took it out to another laboratory that we were working with, a lab in Florida called DNA International, or DLI. And DLI was able to take those fingernail scrapings, and they were able to develop a partial STR CODIS profile, enough that they could use it to identify whose DNA that was. And so then they compared that DNA from the fingernail scrapings of Amy to the Greenville suspect, that's Brashers, and it was a match. So, and that was very compelling. And the other thing that was obviously really compelling was when they researched Brashers a little bit more. He had been arrested 48 hours after yogurt shop, right? And at the New Mexico border of Texas with a 380, the same caliber and the same type. I believe it was I think it was like an ATM backup model. So a lot of compelling information. We had the CODIS match, the gun, and so obviously it was Brashers. And I will say it was a unique case where you had genetic genealogy, which identified Brashers originally by C.C. Moore. Had that not been done, we just know that, oh, well, the yogurt shop killer, killed somebody in South Carolina. That's all we they didn't even know that for sure. You just have the same why. It seems pretty compelling. So the genetic genealogy was, really crucial there. And even CC's like, I knew that guy committed more crimes. I think, when we've looked at it now, I think there's at least 8 murders attributable to Brashers in this case. But it's a unique case where you had to use Y, you had to use genetic genealogy, and you had to use CODIS, as well as, the national ballistics information, NIBINs. So you took all these very modern techniques. I'll say, the CODIS STR is a little more archaic. It's been around for 30 some years, but all these techniques solved the case. And like I said, you got total credit to Dan Jackson and Mindy, who, organized the whole thing. They ran it the right way. They never gave up on it. It was just amazing. Like I said, I was mostly a cheerleader to them on it.
That's pretty cool. And they thanked you, or at least Dan Jackson thanked you in the press conference. I mean, I just think it's so cool what you said, all these different techniques being employed, but also all these different people and expertise is being drawn on in the kind of planning phase. I think it really is a case study of how to handle a cold case and how to not. I think what you said really resonates. If you treat a cold case like a cold case, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you treat it like a case and you're doing these work, no matter how old it is, that's how you're going to solve it. One question for you is, what's next for you? I know you want to solve all the cases now, but how are you going to try to do that?
Well, we're still trying to automate. We're automating this process. It's coming along, and it just costs money. So, we're raising more money to do that, and educating detectives on how this process works. I think the thing that is, I think, the most frustrating to me, and also to my colleague and like Anne-Marie Schubert, as well as those of us, is forensic genetic genealogy is not a cold case technique. It is not. People always say, oh, you're the cold case guys. Yeah, we can do cold cases. It is for any criminal case. Like, you would never say a search warrant is for cold cases or as a geofence for cold cases. No. Those are not cold cases. Those are law enforcement techniques. Those are law enforcement tools. And genetic genealogy is just the same. And I've done presentations where I've shown we've done a dozen different active cases. Brian Koberger, the quadruple murder from Moscow, Idaho, was solved by my colleague at the FBI. And he took him less than a week to do the genetic genealogy. And overall, he was in custody within 43 days of that crime through his and the FBI's efforts to do the genetic genealogy on that case. And we've done other cases. We've done cases where we've done genetic genealogy and solved it in just over 30 days. And it can be even faster than that. It should be used in every case. So to me, and that's when you ask what I want to do, I want to use this on, you have better DNA on cases that happened yesterday than you did on cases that happened 10 years ago. So we should be using this on every case. If a woman is sexually assaulted and we have DNA and it doesn't match in CODIS, why don't we do genetic genealogy before he becomes a serial rapist? Or in other cases, serial killers. It's just why, and the why is, well, because it's hard. There's not a lot of education on it. So that's what we're trying to do, is get law enforcement to, one, be more educated on this. This isn't a cold case technique. That's why we always get invited to cold case conferences, because it's, the famous cases are the cold cases. But as the Brian Koberger case would tell you, it was like, yeah, it can solve these terrible cases quickly before people become serial killers. Man, we've had numerous cases where we've solved, like the Koberger case, these random acts of violence where people break into somebody's house and murder individuals in that house. We catch that guy within, a few weeks or a few months through genetic genealogy before they become, a serial killer or a serial rapist. And so that's where we want to bring it. And that's trying to make this faster and easier for cops.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Make it just a part of the process rather than a whole extra thing that you have to do and you're going to have people be using it more.
Right. Well, like I said earlier, remember 80,000 profiles, so 80,000 crime scene profiles every year. There's, CODIS, we always say bats, around, 300, it's about 300, 33% of the cases, there's a match in CODIS. So think about, 67% of the time, there's no match. That's at 80,000. It's just incredible to me that you have 80,000 individuals. Each of those individuals might be responsible for multiple crimes. So you're not talking just 80,000 crimes. You're probably talking a lot more. Go unidentified. And that's what's, super frustrating. So that's what we want to solve all the cases.
I love it. Yeah, no, I think you will. I'm excited. I mean, it's an exciting time to be following crime, I think, because of this. I guess you kind of breezed through all my questions. Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you think it's important for folks to understand, any of the cases or topics we've talked about, or just anything you wanted to mention?
No, I think we kind of went through it pretty good. I'm good with it.
Just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really been delightful to hear. I could hear you talk for hours, but it's really nice. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks to Steve for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it and appreciate all the work he and others have done on these cases.
Thanks so much for listening to the Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.